Hi everyone, this is Professor Hall. Welcome to Science Fiction Literature. So today, to start off our course, we are going to ask the question, what is science fiction? We'll look at some of the definitions, the literary elements, and how they differ a little bit from other types of fiction. And then we'll take a look at some of the subgenres that we're going to be examining this term. So let's get started. So the definitions, actually, there's no one agreed upon definition for science fiction. But what I tried to do was find a couple that I really liked and appreciated and thought that really apply to what we're going to be talking about this term. So the first is from Webster's, and they define science fiction as fiction dealing principally with the impact of actual or imagined science on society or individuals, or having a scientific factor as an essential orienting component. So here, they're just placing an emphasis on science kind of in general with that last part. But what I put in bold is that idea that it is really an examination of how this imagined science, and sometimes actual science that exists now, discoveries that we've already made, but how do they impact society and how do they impact individuals? This is really going to be an essential component of this course as we go on, that we're not just looking at the scientific advancements, but really how they impact the characters, how they impact the society in which the characters live. The Oxford English Dictionary defines sci-fi as fiction based on imagined future scientific or technological advances and major social or environmental changes, frequently portraying space or time travel and life on other planets. Now, I didn't bold that last part because I think that that's a really interesting stereotype of science fiction, that it's just about space travel, it's time travel, it's alien life, and those are part of it, but not nearly the full extent of what science fiction really is or can be. But I think the first part of this definition, again, scientific, technological advances, and major social or sometimes environmental changes. So not just the future of science, but really the future of mankind, the future of this planet, how all of those components kind of work together. And lastly, this is from the Center for the Study of Science Fiction at Kansas University. Science fiction is the literature of the human species encountering change, whether it arrives via scientific discoveries, technological innovations, natural events, or societal shifts. And I really think that this kind of encapsulates everything that I've been saying so far on this slide, that, yeah, we're going to look at speculative fiction. Sometimes sci-fi is called speculative fiction because it looks at what could the future be like, or even what could our present look like if there were some of these societal shifts. So if you think about a book like The Handmaid's Tale, sometimes that is put into the category of science fiction. There has been some kind of an environmental event that caused women to become infertile, but really the close examination is how that environmental or scientific shift affects society, right? So how does the societal structures change? And I think that as we look at some of the works this semester or this term, this is really the question that we're going to be encountering. It's not just what might space travel look like, or time travel, or life on other planets, although we will in some of our books encounter those things. But really, how do those affect mankind? How do they affect one character's psychology? How do they affect the social structures? And also this question of, can we do this scientifically versus should we do this ethically or morally? So those are some questions that we'll be looking at this term. So the literary elements, I have this little, I'm going to zoom in on this. I have this little cartoon, science fiction. You're just jealous of my jetpack, and so-called proper literature, tut, as they kind of think about things. It's a humorous illustration, but yeah, for a long time, science fiction was kind of put into this category of popular fiction, and many scholars and critics thought popular fiction was not worth examining. Stephen King is an author who writes some science fiction work, some horror, some fantasy, some mixture of all those genres, and I think his take on this is really the correct one, that just because a book is popular does not mean that it's not good or worth studying. And so really, just over the past, I would say, 10, 15 years, people have started to take science fiction a little bit more seriously. And they have so-called literary science fiction works. But I think even popular science fiction works and works that are, as for this class, some of you have asked me, we have books that are sort of initially intended for kids or teens. Why are we looking at them? Because they are still worth studying, and they have a lot more depth and insight than one might look at first on just the surface. So, like all literature, science fiction contains the usual elements that are found in fiction, short stories, and novels. Setting, character development, plot, conflict, themes, symbolism, sometimes figurative language, right? All of those types of things that you probably talked about in your introduction to literature courses. Many genres of literature focus primarily on character, plot, and conflict. In so-called proper literature, in literature that is actually under the genre of being literary, meaning sort of worthy of criticism and analysis, a lot of those, I will say, if you think of like classics, right, that you might study on some of your other courses, those books can often be a little bit slower and a little bit more driven by character. In contrast, science fiction is plot driven many times. You'll see, though, in some of our books that even though they're page turners, there really is quite a bit of character development. And we'll talk about how that connects to the plot elements. But a lot of science fiction focuses on the what if question. Authors speculate what could happen under certain conditions. So, for example, how might a person act if they encountered an alien? Or what if a robot became self-aware? What if we developed technology that allowed us to speak to animals? And there's also the social commentary driving that plot. What I said before, can we, but if we can, should we? I love this. I forgot I put this in here. Science tells you how to clone a Tyrannosaurus Rex. The humanities can tell you why that might be a bad idea. So those are the two things that kind of come together in science fiction. And in contrast to other genres, science fiction also places an emphasis on setting, rather than typical characterization that might be found in more literary works. So what does setting actually entail? This is sort of what people think of at first. I love these two pictures, by the way. I try to find really beautiful art for you guys for this presentation. The physical setting is the actual physical world where the story takes place. So, a frozen alien planet, a typical suburban street, a spaceship, an ever-changing virtual landscape. If you've read or seen the movie, which isn't that good, but if you've read the book Ready Player One, a lot of that takes place in a video game. That's the actual physical setting. But the setting has a little bit more to do with the temporal or time setting, as well as the social situation. Those are also parts of the setting. So a temporal setting, it could be the time in which a story takes place. Here we have from Star Wars, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. A steampunk version of the Old West. A parallel universe that takes place today. A time-traveling adventure spanning 1950 to 2050, right? Kind of depicted here of this person growing older. An unspecified future date. All of those would be the temporal setting. The temporal setting also refers to the length of time during which a story takes place. So it could be an hour, a decade, a year, a number of years, and different books that we're looking at have various lengths of time. Ender's Game, which we're going to read, takes place over the course of many years. Flowers for Algernon takes place over the course of, I believe, 1 year. The proto-science fiction work, Blazing World, takes place over the course of possibly several weeks to months. So think about not just the physical setting of a work, but also the temporal setting. What's the time period? Are we looking at the future? Are we looking at the present? Are we looking at a different version of the past? Is there some space-time bending going on as well? Do we have time travel? In one of our books, we will. So then we have the social setting. We're not reading The Handmaid's Tale. I have taught that book before, but I think this is a good explanation of a social setting and how it might affect a book. This picture down here I love because it talks about the time, the place, and then the social situation. So this looks like maybe New York State in the 1800s, and the social situation is a family living in poverty, right? So the social environment in which the characters exist. What are the manners, the customs, the culture, the moral, the values, etc. A place where marriage has become illegal. A place where two groups are at war over the Earth's remaining fossil fuels. The citizens are divided into classes where each person wears a different color. People are only allowed to live until the age of 80. That's very similar to the book Matched, or the book The Giver. As a protest against large corporations, a social trend spreads in which teens refuse to use computer technology or to interact online. One of the works that we're going to read takes place in a setting which is entirely male. Lucian of Samosata wrote A True History, and on the moon there is a group of men all living there together. So he explores the social setting, not just what it would be like on the moon if we could travel there, but also what it would be like if we only had a society of males, and what would that look like. So that is a really important component that I want you to look for in all the books that we're going to be reading. The bending and blending of genres. Science fiction is really, as you can kind of see so far, a broad term, and it really encompasses many other subgenres. Some critics break science fiction into two major categories: hard science fiction and soft science fiction. So we do have at least one book this term where we have a soft science fiction book. We have another one that is a little bit of hard science fiction and a little bit of soft science fiction kind of blended together. But really, hard science fiction focuses on stories involving the hard sciences. So those are things where you can have a theory and then go through trying to prove that theory. So physics, astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and chemistry. I will say, however, that a lot of physics is theoretical. A lot of blending of astronomy and physics, astrophysics, is highly theoretical. So we have these theories that we are trying to prove. But at any rate, because of the scientific method used, those are referred to as the hard sciences. So a book in which there is robotics involved, that would be a hard science because you're talking about engineering and biology. Then the soft sciences focus on stories involving soft sciences such as sociology, anthropology, psychology. Linguistics would be in that category as well. Sometimes people think of fantasy as being soft science fiction. I don't. I think it's kind of its own thing, connected to science fiction, and sometimes we have a blend of science fantasy. Some other people will say that soft science fiction stories are stories where really it's a little bit more magic than science. So you might have like an explanation. For example, on Star Trek, they'll say, we have to get the dilithium. Well, like, there's no real like explanation for what exactly dilithium does, right? It just sort of does whatever they say it'll do. But for our purposes, we're going to be looking at the soft sciences as these sciences where things cannot be fully proven, and the scientific method is a little bit different. Or at least if you had an experiment in psychology, it would look quite a bit different than an experiment in chemistry. So, other critics list various types of science fiction: alien invasion, alternate history, military science fiction, dystopian, utopian, fantasy, eco-fiction, steampunk, space opera, robots, time travel, etc. I think that some of these are topics of focus rather than a specific genre, but one of the interesting things about science fiction is the way that authors blend and bend these genres of literature when shaping their stories. So you could have an alternate history that is also steampunk. You could have a military science fiction story that's also a space opera. You could have a dystopian work that also involves robots, right? You could have a blend of fantasy and science fiction and examine what that would look like if you have kind of mythological creatures alongside aliens, or mythological creatures that aren't aliens. So that's something I'd like you to look for. This is a little graph of various subgenres of fiction, and you'll see hard and soft science fiction, romantic, alternate history, kind of coming out of this soft sci-fi, military, cyberpunk, space opera coming out of the hard science fiction, the connection here to fantasy, comic, epic fantasy, which is kind of connected to romance. So the point is, I think, this is kind of an interesting chart, but some of these things are blended together much more. I've seen psychological thrillers that are also hard science fiction stories. I've seen historical mysteries or paranormal romance that also have an element of science fiction to them. So one of the ideas for this course as we go, we'll talk about the subgenres that each of our books kind of falls into and where it is on this chart. So genre is this term: a true story, sometimes called a true history, by Lucian of Samosata, and A Blazing New World, sometimes called A New Blazing World, by Margaret Cavendish. These are works of proto-science fiction. Here's a little bit of a graphic novel depiction of Lucian's true history. Proto-science fiction works were written before the emergence of science fiction as its own genre. So as science fiction kind of developed into a genre, but these are things that were written much before. So they blend things like fantasy, mythology, speculative fiction, adventure. They have some of these elements of science fiction, but they're not exactly pure science fiction works. A True History was written around, if I recall correctly, about 130 AD. Blazing New World was written, it published at least, in 1666. So long before, a couple hundred years before science fiction really began to develop as a separate genre of literature. So I think it'll be interesting for us to kind of trace that development and see historically some of the beginnings of science fiction. Then we're going to look at Frankenstein. Frankenstein is sometimes called Gothic horror. Sometimes it's called horror science fiction. Sometimes Gothic science fiction. Back then it was called scientific fiction. They kind of blended those words together. I love this view because often the Frankenstein's monster is depicted quite grotesquely, but here we just see him as almost a man considering himself and his own reflection, which is a big part of that book. So Gothic fiction comes from the Romantic tradition of the 1800s. About 1800 to 1850 was that Gothic tradition, or the Romantic tradition. Imaginative settings, gloomy atmospheres, the use of terror and fear, improbable plots, and an interest in the grotesque. The difference is that Frankenstein does have an actual scientific element to it. We'll talk about that more when we get into looking at that book, but essentially it has to do with anatomy, with biology, a little bit of chemistry thrown in there, what they called at the time natural philosophy. And so you have these Gothic elements, if you think about like Edgar Allan Poe, mixed together with a little bit of science fiction. And really, a lot of people think of this as the first science fiction book, at least the first one written in English. A blending of speculative science and a little bit of fantasy in the form of supernatural elements that might break the laws of science, but certainly speculate as to how that might be able to occur. It also has a lot of philosophy in that book. I think more than people might guess if they've seen any of the movies or sort of TV adaptations of Frankenstein. They focus a lot more on the Gothic elements and a lot less on the philosophy. But I think it's important to note that these early science fiction and proto-science fiction works really set the tone that sci-fi really many times is looking at philosophy and asking these questions. Will this affect humanity? So after that, we're going to look at War of the Worlds, another very early science fiction book. That is in the subgenre of sci-fi adventure, hard sci-fi, alien invasion. Really, it's actually sometimes that's a subgenre, sometimes that's a feature of science fiction. We'll talk too about how at the time there was a genre of literature that was just looking at invasion, where one country invaded another. So Wells takes this idea and looks at it in science fiction terms. What if we were invaded by an alien race, an extraterrestrial race that did not know anything about us? So in this type of story, aliens invade Earth. Sometimes they aim to exterminate all life, to enslave people under an intense state, to harvest people for food, to steal the planet's resources, or to destroy the planet. But other times, authors have taken this idea and kind of inverted it, and the aliens are there to help mankind turn away from self-destruction. So it's kind of interesting to see this book, because that's really the prototype, the first book of its type that many others copied later on. The invasion scenario is also used as an allegory for societal ills, and again, looking at society and not just the science. Then we're going to read A Princess of Mars. Princess of Mars is a planetary romance and space opera. So there we have some artwork there. Planetary romances feature melodramatic adventure, exotic alien planets, a risk-taking hero who falls in love with a princess in distress, at least in this book. They focus much more on romantic elements. So a little bit less hard science, a little bit more soft science into kind of the realm of fantasy. But because they take place on alien worlds, there is that science fiction element to it. But there's really focuses on the adventure, the characterization of the hero, and the alien world in which this takes place. But you can tell even from the art here, right? as opposed to one of the film versions of War of the Worlds. Yes, this is supposed to be an exotic adventure, right? And swords. Swords in space. That's basically what a space opera is. Now, this sets the stage for a lot of other works. As I mentioned earlier, Star Wars, right? Long ago in a galaxy far, far away. That's basically the idea of a planetary romance. Brave New World is our next book after that. And we're moving along in time, right? So, to go back, War of the Worlds was published in 1897. Princess of Mars, I think, is 1912. And now Brave New World is 1938. This is dystopian. So utopian literature imagines a future in which everything is perfect. Dystopian literature examines the flaws in these utopian models. So in a search for perfection, what could possibly go wrong? Very often, this subgenre focuses on future developments in both hard and soft sciences. So the social setting of the story is going to be quite important, and really looking at what the science is and how the science has affected humanity to create this horrifying vision of the future that here looks clean and pristine and lovely. After that, we're going to look at Flowers for Algernon. This was published first as a short story in 1960 and then as a book in 1966. So soft science fiction. I wanted to pick at least one book that was a pure soft science fiction novel for you. This subgenre is really concerned with developments of the soft sciences, as I mentioned before, psychology, sociology, anthropology, rather than the hard sciences of astronomy, physics, or chemistry. Sometimes these books are not as scientifically plausible as hard science fiction novels. I think that with Flowers for Algernon, that's the difference. I think it is entirely plausible, and I think if the science were there would be quite a debate about it. There already is in some circles about Flowers for Algernon looks at a man who has an intellectual disability and an operation that can cure it. And we cannot do that yet with adults, but there are ways of manipulating genes when we have children in terms of in vitro fertilization, and that's a debate that goes on even today. So it's quite an interesting book. Then A Wrinkle in Time, looking at some science fantasy. Science fantasy, this book was also published in the later 1960s. Science fantasy blends elements of both science fiction and fantasy, as you can kind of see from the children riding the back of a centaur here. A world may be scientifically possible, but there are some type of elements that are either inspired by mythology, folklore, fairy tales, or there's some kind of magical elements that would basically break the rules of science. Unlike horror novels, which also feature supernatural elements, science fantasy is not as interested typically in the grotesque or macabre. Now, A Wrinkle in Time actually blends quite a number of different genres, and I'll get into that later, but I would say that as an overarching understanding of the book, you could say that it is a work of science fantasy. Then we're going to look at Ender's Game, military science fiction. So from the soft back to hard sci-fi. Futuristic technologies for the purposes of war. Typically in military science fiction books, they're hard sci-fi, which this one is, with plausible technological developments. And I'll talk about that more later. In Ender's Game in particular, outside of this picture here that I've found for you, a lot of the technology, the book was published in 1985, and a lot of the technology in the book, possibly 1983, I think was the short story. But a lot of the tech in the book we have today. So things like tablets and the internet, he was kind of looking toward as possibilities for the near future. Principal characters are members of a military organization or involved in military activity. Here we have people basically training to be leaders in the military. Sometimes in military science fiction, wars and battles occur in outer space or on a different planet, and this is tied again to the adventure or alien invasion subgenres of literature. So you can see, I hope, how all of these things are tied together. One of the things a couple of people asked about books for this term, and I will say a few things about this. First, I wanted to pick a variety of genres. I wanted to have a variety of things throughout various time periods, because these books are as much of a product of their times as they are looking forward. For example, Wrinkle in Time, pictured here, has some feminist elements that really wouldn't be fully developed until the 1970s, in terms of having a mother who's a scientist whose husband is not around, and having a girl who's very smart and who is angry because she's not treated equally in school in comparison to the boys in her class, right? So Flowers for Algernon is talking about psychology, and it's looking at disability, but really through the lens of the 1950s and 60s and how they thought of disability. A lot of times now we think of things in terms of neurological differences, as opposed to something that handicaps someone. So that's part of it. We're looking at different genres. We're looking at different things in various time periods. Also, the length of the books. Some of these are part of series, but a lot of science fiction books are not standalone. They are long, epic, and for a summer course in particular, that can be difficult. So I thought rather than have like 3 long epic sci-fi books, we can really dig into a variety of genres and have some books that are a tad bit shorter, but have quite a bit to talk about and discuss. So coming up, another look at the history of science fiction here and how all of these genres are kind of blended and mixed up together. We're going to look at proto-science fiction. We're going to talk about the origins and development of science fiction as a genre, and we will look at those stories and themes and how they influenced later authors. So the first 3 works that I talked about, New Blazing World, Frankenstein, and A True History, all of those I'm giving you guys excerpts from, and we will give you a brief summary of those excerpts and then kind of dig into some of the issues and themes and all of that. So I'm really excited. I hope that you enjoy the books for this class, and I hope that after this you have a little bit better understanding of some of the facets of science fiction. Thanks, everybody.